They tell us that every dynasty has an ending, that kings rise, rule, and inevitably fall into silence, their names fading into footnotes, their bloodlines dissolving into obscurity. History, as it is taught, is orderly like that. It prefers clean conclusions, clear successions, definitive deaths. But there are moments, quiet, unsettling moments, when the past refuses to stay buried, when a name lingers longer than it should, when a dynasty officially declared extinct continues to echo through monasteries, manuscripts, legends, and whispers carried across centuries. This is the story of one such echo. In the official chronicles of early medieval Europe, the Merovingian kings are remembered as a crude prelude to something greater. A primitive dynasty of warrior chieftains, eventually replaced by more capable rulers. Their fall is described almost casually. A weak final king, shorn of his hair, sent away to a monastery, his line extinguished without resistance. A quiet ending, a necessary one. History closes the book and moves on. And yet, for a dynasty that supposedly vanished so completely, the Merovingians left behind an unusually long shadow. Long after their removal from power, stories persisted that the last Merovingian king did not truly die, that his bloodline continued in secret, that his fall was not an end, but a transition, something closer to twilight than darkness, a dimming rather than an extinction. Medieval monks hinted at it in careful language. Nobles whispered it in genealogies that never quite aligned. Later centuries would cloak the idea in symbols, prophecies, and sacred myths. At the center of these whispers is a question that history rarely likes to ask. What if the Merovingians were not simply kings? What if they represented something older, stranger, and more dangerous than political authority? To understand why this question refuses to disappear, we must begin not with their rise, but with their supposed end. A moment described in textbooks with deceptive simplicity. The year is the mid-8th century. The throne of the Franks is occupied by a king who holds the title, but none of the power. His name is Childeric III, remembered as the last Merovingian ruler. According to the official story, he is deposed by Pepin the Short, a man backed by the church and armed with papal blessing. Childeric's long hair, symbol of his royal authority, is cut. He is sent to live out his days in a monastery. And with that, we are told the Merovingian dynasty ends. But even this moment is strangely ritualistic. The shaving of the king's hair was not merely an act of humiliation. In Merovingian culture, hair was sacred. It was the visible sign of divine legitimacy, something closer to a vow than a fashion. To cut it was not just to dethrone a king. It was to sever a sacred bond, to symbolically strip away something believed to be inherited, not granted. Power that flowed through blood, not coronations. Why would such symbolism be necessary if the dynasty was already weak? Why such care taken to neutralize not just the man, but what he represented? Some medieval sources suggest that the Merovingians were believed to possess a unique kind of authority, one rooted in ancient tradition rather than Christian doctrine. They were kings by blood, not by blessing. Sacred rulers whose legitimacy predated the church itself. This made them dangerous, not because they were strong, but because they represented an alternative idea of power, one that could not be controlled by Rome. And so, the Merovingians were not merely replaced. They were carefully unmade. Yet even as official history declares them finished, other records tell a quieter, more uncertain story. Chronicles that speak of missing bodies, of ambiguous deaths, of sons sent away rather than executed, of bloodlines absorbed into noble houses, hidden under new names. The language becomes vague precisely where clarity should exist. Dates blur, names repeat, certainty dissolves. And there are the prophecies. Scattered through medieval Europe are cryptic references to a king who will return or a hidden heir of the Franks. These texts never name the Merovingians directly, but the symbols are unmistakable. Long hair, sacred blood, exile, and eventual restoration during a time of great disorder. Such prophecies were dangerous enough that many were copied imperfectly, altered, or quietly forgotten. Others survived only in fragments, preserved by monks who may not have fully understood what they were guarding. What is striking is not that these legends exist. Every fallen dynasty produces myths, but how persistent and geographically widespread they are. From northern France to the Pyrenees, from royal genealogies to church carvings, the same idea repeats itself. The Merovingian line did not end. It withdrew. This notion transforms their fall into something entirely different. Not a collapse, but a concealment. Not defeat, but dormancy. Like embers buried beneath ash, waiting for a moment when the world would once again require the kind of kingship they embodied. Later centuries would reinterpret this idea through new lenses. During the Crusades, some believed the Merovingian bloodline was tied to the guardianship of holy relics. In the Renaissance, scholars speculated about ancient royal knowledge inherited rather than taught. In modern times, the story would be recast again, woven into theories of sacred bloodlines, hidden monarchies, and suppressed histories. Each era reshaped the myth, but none erased it. Perhaps because at its core, the story of the Merovingians speaks to a deeper unease. The fear that history is not merely written by the victors, but edited by them. That certain truths are not destroyed, only buried beneath layers of narrative. If the Merovingians truly were insignificant, why did their memory prove so difficult to extinguish? Why did later rulers feel the need to delegitimize them so thoroughly, portraying them as weak, foolish, or irrelevant? Why erase not just their power, but their mystique? The answer may lie in what they symbolized. A time when kings were believed to rule by divine nature, not institutional approval. When authority flowed from ancestry and ritual rather than law and bureaucracy. Such a concept was incompatible with a centralized church and an emerging medieval state. It had to be replaced with something more manageable. And so, the Merovingians were reframed. Their sacred aspects dismissed as superstition. Their legends reduced to folklore. Their fall described as inevitable progress. But history has a way of revealing its cracks. And through those cracks, the old stories whisper. The king who would not die is not necessarily a man. He is an idea. The idea that legitimacy can be inherited in ways that institutions cannot control. That power may retreat rather than vanish. That some endings are designed to look final, while quietly preserving what they claim to destroy. As we move deeper into the world of the Merovingians, we will encounter a dynasty unlike any other in European history. Kings who ruled not only with swords, but with symbols. A bloodline surrounded by ritual, secrecy, and myth. A twilight age that official history insists is over, but which may never have truly ended. And like all twilights, it is difficult to say where the day truly ends and where the night begins. Long before the Merovingian kings wore crowns, before their names were written in the chronicles or whispered through prophecies, the world that would give rise to them was already unraveling. To understand the mystery surrounding their bloodline, one must first step into this collapsing landscape, a world caught between the death of an empire and the uncertain birth of something new. It was an age without clear borders, without stable authority, and without a shared vision of the future. In this chaos, power did not belong to those who claimed it on paper, but to those who could embody it in flesh, ritual, and belief. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was no longer an empire in any meaningful sense. Its roads still cut across Europe like veins in a corpse. Its cities still stood, but the system that had once animated them was gone. Roman governors vanished, legions withdrew, and taxation collapsed. What remained was a vacuum, political, spiritual, and psychological. Into that vacuum poured fear, uncertainty, and opportunity. For centuries, Rome had provided more than administration. It had given people a sense of order, a belief that the world, though harsh, was governed by rules. When that order collapsed, so did the collective certainty of the people living within its former borders. Gaul, the land that would later become France, was especially vulnerable. It was a crossroads of cultures, Romanized cities, rural tribal communities, migrating Germanic peoples, and lingering pagan traditions all coexisted uneasily. No single belief system held absolute dominance. This fractured world did not simply need rulers. It needed symbols. It needed figures who could stand at the intersection of the old and the new, the sacred and the martial, the Roman past and the barbarian future. The Merovingians would emerge precisely because they answered that need. Unlike later medieval kingdoms, early post-Roman Gaul was not governed by institutions. There was no stable bureaucracy capable of enforcing law across vast territories. Authority was personal. It flowed from individuals who could command loyalty through charisma, ancestry, and perceived favor of higher powers. In this environment, lineage mattered more than law, and myth mattered more than documents. The Germanic tribes who settled in Gaul, most notably the Franks, did not view kingship as a contractual role. A king was not simply chosen, he was recognized. His authority was believed to be innate, something revealed through success in battle, prosperity of the people, and signs interpreted as divine approval. This belief system blended easily with older Celtic and Roman traditions, where rulers were often seen as intermediaries between the human and the divine. Before Christianity fully reshaped Europe, the sacred and the political were inseparable. Kings performed rituals. They presided over seasonal ceremonies. They were believed to influence fertility, weather, and victory. A weak harvest or military defeat was not just a failure of leadership. It was evidence that the ruler had lost divine favor. This is the environment in which the earliest Merovingian ancestors appear, not as crowned monarchs, but as war leaders wrapped in legend. Their origins are deliberately obscure. Even medieval chroniclers seemed unsure how to describe them, often mixing genealogy with myth. Some accounts traced their lineage to ancient Trojan heroes, others to sea creatures or divine beings. These stories were not meant to be taken literally, but symbolically. They signaled that this was not an ordinary bloodline. The ambiguity itself is revealing. When a dynasty's origins are mythologized rather than clarified, it often means that its authority rested on belief rather than proof. The Merovingians did not need to explain where they came from. Their legitimacy was self-evident to those who followed them. As Roman authority receded, many former imperial elites attempted to maintain power through familiarity, using Roman titles, laws, and traditions. But these remnants lacked vitality. They belonged to a world that no longer functioned. The Merovingians, by contrast, represented something alive. They were not restorers of Rome, but inheritors of its vacuum. Religion during this period was equally unstable. Christianity existed, but it was fragmented, localized, and often intertwined with older pagan practices. Rural populations continued to honor sacred springs, forests, and ancestral spirits. Saints replaced local gods, but rituals remained strikingly similar. This blending created a spiritual gray zone, one in which sacred kingship could thrive. In such a world, a ruler who could navigate both belief systems held immense power. The Merovingians did exactly that. They did not initially present themselves as champions of Christianity or enemies of paganism. They existed above the divide, absorbing legitimacy from both sides. This neutrality made them indispensable. The idea of the sacred king did not originate with the Merovingians, but they embodied it more completely than any dynasty that followed. Their authority was not enforced through law codes or clerical approval. It was recognized through ritual, tradition, and inherited symbolism. Long hair, ceremonial weapons, and ancestral memory became markers of a role that was as spiritual as it was political. Violence was constant in this era, but it was not chaotic. Warfare followed patterns, seasons, and rituals. Victory was interpreted as divine endorsement. A successful war leader was assumed to be favored by unseen forces. Over time, success compounded legitimacy. Families that won consistently were believed to be chosen. This belief explains why certain bloodlines rose while others disappeared. It was not simply strength that mattered, but continuity. The Merovingians did not just win battles, they endured, generation after generation. Their lineage remained associated with authority, reinforcing the idea that their right to rule was inherited, not earned. What is often overlooked is how fragile this arrangement truly was. Sacred kingship works only as long as belief is maintained. Once authority becomes questioned, once alternative systems of legitimacy emerge, the entire structure begins to crack. The seeds of the Merovingians' eventual downfall were already present in the world that gave birth to them. As Christianity slowly consolidated its power, it introduced a rival source of legitimacy. Authority no longer flowed only from blood and ritual, but from divine sanction interpreted by the church. Kings began to rule not because they were believed to be sacred, but because they were crowned by bishops. This shift would take centuries, but its consequences were inevitable. Yet in the early days, the Merovingians were perfectly adapted to their environment. They were products of transition, neither fully pagan nor fully Christian, neither Roman nor entirely barbarian. They existed in the in-between, and that is where their power lay. Understanding this world is essential because it reveals why the Merovingians were never just another dynasty. They were the embodiment of a fading way of understanding power, a bridge between ancient sacred authority and emerging institutional rule. When later rulers sought to replace them, they were not merely changing kings. They were changing the meaning of kingship itself. This is why the Merovingians could not simply be overthrown. They had to be redefined. Their past had to be reshaped. Their mystique had to be reduced to folklore. Because as long as people remembered a time when kings ruled by inherited sanctity rather than external approval, the foundations of the new order remained unstable. The world that birthed the Merovingians was chaotic, uncertain, and deeply spiritual. It demanded rulers who could carry meaning as well as swords. And for a time, the Merovingians answered that demand so completely that even centuries later, history has not fully escaped their shadow. They were born from collapse, shaped by belief, and sustained by myth. And once such a dynasty enters history, it never truly leaves it. The story of the Merovingians truly begins to sharpen into focus with the figure of Clovis, a name that stands at the threshold between legend and recorded history. Before him, the Merovingians existed as shadowy war leaders, half-mythical figures ruling fragmented territories through force and ancestral prestige. With Clovis, however, something changes. The dynasty steps out of obscurity and into destiny. Yet the transformation that defines Clovis is not merely political or military. It is spiritual, symbolic, and deeply strategic, a conversion that would reshape Europe while concealing layers of meaning still debated today. Clovis was born into a world already primed for transformation. The Roman Empire was gone, but its memory lingered like a ghost. Christianity was spreading, but it had not yet unified belief. Pagan traditions still pulsed beneath the surface of daily life. In this unstable environment, Clovis inherited leadership of the Salian Franks while still a young man. From the beginning, he proved ruthless, intelligent, and acutely aware of symbolism. He understood that power was not only seized on the battlefield, it was legitimized in the minds of the people. Official history tells us that Clovis was a pagan ruler who gradually came under the influence of Christianity, largely through his wife, Clotilde, a Burgundian princess and devout Christian. According to the most famous account, Clovis promised to convert to Christianity if he were granted victory in battle. When he triumphed against the Alemanni at the Battle of Tolbiac, he fulfilled that vow. He was baptized by Saint Remigius, Bishop of Reims, and with that act, the Franks became Christian, paving the way for medieval Europe. It is a powerful story, clean, moral, divinely approved. But like many such stories, it simplifies what may have been a far more complex ritual event. Clovis's baptism was not merely a personal declaration of faith. It was a public transformation of kingship itself. Unlike other Germanic rulers who adopted Arian Christianity, Clovis converted to Nicene Christianity, the form aligned with Rome. This decision set him apart and won him the support of the Gallo-Roman population and the Church. Yet the ceremony itself was steeped in symbolism that goes beyond political convenience. Medieval accounts describe the baptism in almost mythical terms. A miraculous vial of holy oil is said to have descended from heaven, delivered by a dove. This oil, later known as the Holy Ampulla, was believed to carry divine authority and would be used in the coronation of French kings for centuries. Such imagery places Clovis not merely as a convert, but as a chosen ruler, sanctified in a way that transcended ordinary baptism. This is where esoteric interpretations begin to diverge from mainstream history. Some scholars and alternative historians suggest that Clovis's conversion was not a rejection of earlier sacred traditions, but an adaptation of them. Rather than abandoning pagan kingship, Clovis may have been rebranding it, folding ancient sacral authority into a Christian framework. In this view, the baptism was less about submission to the Church and more about asserting a unique form of divine kingship that blended old and new beliefs. Clovis did not immediately dismantle pagan customs, nor did he rule as a humble servant of the Church. On the contrary, he continued to wage brutal wars, eliminate rivals, and consolidate power through bloodshed. Christianity did not soften him. It legitimized him. The Church gained protection. Clovis gained moral authority. But the deeper structure of sacred kingship remained intact. The concept of the king as divinely favored did not originate with Christianity. It existed long before, embedded in Indo-European and Germanic traditions. Kings were seen as vessels of cosmic order. Their health reflected the health of the land. Their blood carried sacred potency. Christianity, in its early medieval form, did not destroy this idea. It absorbed it. Clovis's baptism can therefore be read as an initiation rather than a conversion. A ritual passage that marked his role as mediator between heaven and earth, now framed through Christian symbolism. The miraculous oil, the dove, the timing, all suggest that this was meant to be remembered not as a theological choice, but as a sacred event. What followed reinforces this interpretation. After his baptism, Clovis embarked on a campaign to unify Gaul under his rule. He defeated rival kings, absorbed territories, and positioned himself as the sole legitimate ruler of the Franks. Yet he did not rule through Roman law or Christian doctrine alone. He ruled through lineage, ritual, and fear, hallmarks of ancient sacred kingship. The Church, for its part, tolerated this ambiguity. In Clovis, it found a protector willing to enforce its authority militarily. In return, it sanctified his rule. This uneasy alliance would define European politics for centuries. But at this early stage, the balance still leaned toward the king. This is crucial to understanding why the Merovingians would later become a problem. Clovis established a model in which royal authority was inherited, sacred, and semi-independent from ecclesiastical control. His descendants inherited not just a throne, but a mystical legitimacy rooted in this foundational moment. The baptism at Reims became the spiritual cornerstone of the French monarchy, yet its meaning was carefully curated over time. Later chroniclers emphasize Clovis as the first Christian king, minimizing the continuity between his rule and earlier sacred traditions. But traces remain. The emphasis on royal blood, the persistence of ritual symbols, the belief that kings possessed healing powers. These ideas did not originate with Christianity. They survived through it. Clovis himself seemed aware of the power he was wielding. He reportedly expressed regret that he had not lived during the time of Christ so that he could have avenged him personally. This strange statement reveals how Clovis perceived his role, not as a humble believer, but as a divinely appointed enforcer, a king whose authority extended beyond the temporal world. The conversion also served another, subtler purpose. By aligning himself with Rome, Clovis positioned his dynasty as the rightful successor to imperial authority in the West, not as an emperor, but as something older and more primal. a sacred king ruling a Christian people. This synthesis gave the Merovingians unparalleled legitimacy. And yet, embedded within this alliance was the seed of future conflict. The church had sanctified a bloodline it could not fully control. Over time, as ecclesiastical authority grew more centralized, this arrangement became untenable. A dynasty that ruled by inherited sanctity rather than clerical approval was a threat. This tension would not explode immediately. For generations, the Merovingians benefited from the myth Clovis created. But as centuries passed, the meaning of his conversion would be slowly reshaped. The sacred king would be recast as a Christian monarch. Blood would give way to blessing. Ritual would yield to doctrine. Still, the memory of Clovis's baptism lingered in its original, potent form. The holy ampulla was guarded carefully. Coronations at Reims became elaborate ceremonies. Each new king was symbolically linked back to Clovis, reinforcing the idea that royal authority flowed through an unbroken sacred lineage. This continuity is what made the eventual removal of the Merovingians so delicate. One cannot simply overthrow a dynasty founded on divine ritual without undermining the very concept of kingship. And so, when the time came, history would be rewritten. The sacred elements would be downplayed. The dynasty would be portrayed as weak, decadent, obsolete. But Clovis's shadow could not be erased. His conversion was not just a turning point in European history. It was a moment when ancient kingship adapted to survive in a changing world. A sacred transformation disguised as religious conformity. And in that moment, the Merovingians secured a legacy that would haunt their successors long after their crowns were taken away. What began at the baptismal font in Reims was not simply the birth of a Christian kingdom. It was the consecration of a bloodline whose meaning would be debated, suppressed, and mythologized for over 1,000 years. Among all the customs that set the Merovingian kings apart from other rulers of early medieval Europe, none was more striking, more symbolic, or more misunderstood than their long hair. To modern eyes, it may seem like a minor cultural detail, a simple matter of appearance or fashion. But to the people of early Gaul, the long hair of the Merovingian kings was not cosmetic. It was sacred, it was political, and above all, it was believed to be the visible proof of divine authority. In a world where most men cut their hair short for practicality, warfare, and hygiene, the Merovingian kings stood apart like living relics of an older age. Their hair flowed long over their shoulders, uncut from birth, carefully guarded throughout their lives. This was not vanity. It was identity. To cut a king's hair was not to insult him. It was to unmake him. The origins of this belief stretch far beyond the Merovingians themselves. Long hair, as a symbol of sacred power, appears repeatedly across ancient cultures. In the Hebrew Bible, the Nazarites, holy men set apart for divine service, were forbidden from cutting their hair. Samson's legendary strength was tied directly to his unshorn locks. When his hair was cut, his power vanished. This was not coincidence. Hair was believed to hold spiritual force, a conduit between the human body and divine energy. Similar beliefs existed among Germanic, Celtic, and Indo-European traditions. Warriors swore oaths over their hair. Priests grew it long as a sign of consecration. Kings preserved it as a symbol of legitimacy. Hair was thought to carry memory, ancestry, and spiritual essence. To preserve it was to preserve continuity with the sacred past. The Merovingians inherited and institutionalized this belief. Their long hair marked them as different not only from common people, but from other nobles and warriors. It announced their status instantly. Even a child of Merovingian blood could be recognized by his hair alone. This made the dynasty unmistakable and impossible to replicate. Chroniclers of the time noted this feature repeatedly, often with a mixture of reverence and discomfort. Roman-influenced writers, accustomed to short hair and clean-shaven authority, viewed the Merovingian appearance as archaic, even unsettling. Yet they could not deny its impact. The long-haired kings commanded loyalty not because they dressed like rulers, but because they embodied rulership. This embodiment was central to Merovingian power. Their authority was not conferred by a crown placed on the head. It was believed to grow naturally from the body itself. The king did not wear power. He was power. His blood carried it. His hair displayed it. This belief made the Merovingians exceptionally difficult to challenge. One could defeat a Merovingian army, but defeating the idea of a sacred bloodline was another matter entirely. Over time, the long hair became inseparable from kingship itself. A Merovingian without long hair was unthinkable. The act of shaving a king was not merely symbolic. It was terminal. Once shorn, a Merovingian lost the right to rule. He became something else, something lesser. This was understood by both supporters and enemies of the dynasty. What is especially revealing is that rivals to the Merovingians did not attempt to adopt the long hair tradition. They cannot. It was not transferable. It belonged exclusively to the bloodline. Anyone else growing long hair would have appeared ridiculous, even blasphemous. Sacred symbols lose their power when imitated without legitimacy. This exclusivity reinforces the idea that Merovingian kingship was rooted in something inherited, not earned. Later medieval monarchs would rule by coronation, by law, by church approval. The Merovingians ruled by being born. Their bodies themselves were evidence of divine favor. The church initially tolerated this symbolism because it could not yet replace it. Early Christianity was still adapting to local traditions, absorbing rather than erasing them. Saints took the place of local gods. Holy relics replaced sacred groves, and sacred kings were reframed as Christian rulers. But the long hair remained, quietly resisting full reinterpretation. For churchmen, the symbolism was deeply uncomfortable. If a king's authority came from his blood and body, what role did the church truly play? Blessings could sanctify a ruler, but they could not create one. This tension would grow over centuries, slowly transforming admiration into suspicion. By the later Merovingian period, chroniclers began to shift their tone. The long hair, once described with awe, was increasingly portrayed as strange, excessive, even decadent. The kings themselves were depicted as passive figures, do-nothing kings, as later historians would call them, while real power supposedly rested elsewhere. This narrative served a purpose. It undermined the sacred image without directly confronting it. But the hair remained potent, which is why it had to be dealt with so carefully at the dynasty's end. When the final Merovingian king was deposed, he was not executed. He was not publicly humiliated in the streets. He was shaved, his hair was cut, and he was sent to a monastery. This act was surgical in its precision. It neutralized the sacred symbol while avoiding martyrdom. It transformed a king into a monk, another sacred role, but one stripped of political authority. This moment reveals everything about how seriously the long hair tradition was taken. If the Merovingians were truly irrelevant by that point, there would have been no need for such ritual care. A simple execution would have sufficed. Instead, their power was symbolically severed, not violently destroyed. Even after their removal, the symbolism lingered. Stories circulated of hidden heirs whose hair was secretly preserved, of children smuggled away before they could be shorn, of bloodlines that survived under different names, carrying the sacred mark invisibly rather than openly. These stories persisted because the belief itself had never been fully extinguished. Hair, after all, grows back, and so did the legend. In later centuries, echoes of the long-haired kings reappeared in unexpected places. Medieval art depicted Christ with flowing hair, emphasizing his role as divine king. French monarchs preserved elaborate coronation rituals that emphasized anointing, lineage, and continuity with Clovis. The holy ampulla remained central, linking each ruler back to his sacred origin. Even when the Merovingians were gone, their model of kingship haunted their successors. The idea that authority flowed through blood rather than consent never fully disappeared. It resurfaced in divine right theories, in royal healing rituals, and in persistent fascination with sacred genealogy. What made the Merovingians dangerous was not their armies or their wealth. It was their symbolism. Symbols outlive institutions. And the long hair of the Merovingian kings symbolized a world in which power was organic, inherited, and inseparable from the human body. This is why their memory had to be reshaped. Their hair had to be dismissed as barbaric. Their kings had to be portrayed as weak. Their sacred authority had to be reframed as superstition. Only then could a new model of rulership take its place, one controlled by law, bureaucracy, and clerical sanction. Yet even now, centuries later, the image of the long-haired king remains unsettling. It speaks to a time when leadership was believed to be written into flesh and blood, when kings were not crowned, but revealed, when power was not granted, but recognized. And perhaps this is why the Merovingians continue to fascinate, because their long hair reminds us that history once believed authority was not something you put on, but something you were born carrying. As the Merovingian dynasty settled into power, something unusual began to surround its kings, something that later historians would struggle to explain away. Beyond battles and treaties, beyond land and succession, there emerged a quiet but persistent belief that these rulers possessed abilities that went beyond ordinary human limits. They were not remembered merely as kings, but as figures touched by something otherworldly. Healers, seers, guardians of forces unseen. Over time, these beliefs would be softened, ridiculed, or erased. But in their own age, they were taken seriously. To understand why the Merovingian kings were perceived this way, one must remember the worldview of early medieval Europe. This was not a world divided neatly between the natural and the supernatural. The two were inseparable. Illness had spiritual causes. Victory in battle reflected divine favor. The king stood at the center of this cosmic balance. If the land prospered, it was because the ruler was in harmony with higher forces. If disaster struck, it meant something had gone wrong at the very top. Within this framework, the Merovingian kings were believed to embody a special role. Chroniclers described them performing acts that blurred the line between ritual and magic. They were said to cure illness with a touch, to bless crops, to protect their people from misfortune. Later French kings would famously claim the power to heal scrofula, the king's evil, through royal touch, a tradition many scholars trace back to Merovingian precedent. Official history tends to dismiss such accounts as superstition. But what matters is not whether these powers were real in a modern sense, but that people believed in them. Belief itself is a form of power, and the Merovingians possessed it in abundance. Some sources go further, describing the kings as possessing knowledge inherited through blood rather than taught through institutions. Knowledge of symbols, of rituals, of timing. The king was not just a warrior chief. He was a keeper of ancient customs that governed when wars were fought, when assemblies were held, and when sacred oaths were sworn. These customs were not written down. They were remembered, embodied, and passed through lineage. This is where the idea of the sorcerer king emerges, not in the sense of casting spells, but in embodying sacred authority. In many ancient cultures, the ruler was expected to perform rituals that ensured cosmic balance. He did not rule despite these duties, but because of them. The Merovingians appear to have preserved this role longer than most. Roman observers found this deeply unsettling. The Roman tradition separated religion and administration. Power came from law, senate, and empire. The Merovingian model was older, less rational, and far harder to control. A king who ruled because people believed he was chosen by unseen forces could not easily be replaced by decree. As Christianity spread, this tension intensified. The church offered a new explanation for the sacred. Miracles were now mediated through saints, relics, and clergy. A king who appeared to wield sacred power independently of the church represented a theological problem. Was his power divine? And if so, who sanctioned it? Rather than confronting this question directly, later writers began to subtly reframe Merovingian kingship. Accounts of miracles were downplayed. Ritual roles were ignored. Kings were portrayed as passive, indulgent, or ineffective. The narrative shifted from sacred guardians to lazy figureheads. Over time, the mystical aura faded in the official record, but not in popular memory. Folk traditions preserved what chronicles erased. In rural areas, stories persisted of Merovingian kings who could speak with animals, foresee disasters, or command the loyalty of nature itself. These tales were not seen as fiction. They were explanations for why the dynasty had ruled for so long. A family favored by the unseen world could not easily be displaced. Even the physical descriptions of Merovingian kings contribute to this image. Chroniclers noted their unusual appearance: the long hair, the elaborate attire, the deliberate separation from ordinary life. The king did not simply live among his people. He existed apart, approached through ritual, surrounded by taboo. This separation reinforced the idea that he was different, set aside, carrying responsibilities invisible to most. Some alternative historians have suggested that the Merovingians preserved fragments of pre-Christian priestly knowledge, not formal doctrine, but symbolic understanding passed orally. This would explain why their power appeared irrational to later generations. Oral traditions leave no archive. When the bloodline is broken, the knowledge disappears with it. This possibility unsettles conventional history, which prefers to see progress as linear. But sacred knowledge has often been cyclical, hidden during certain periods, resurfacing in others. If the Merovingians were guardians rather than innovators, their role would not be to change the world, but to preserve something ancient until the time was right. This perspective casts their eventual downfall in a different light. Perhaps they were not overthrown because they failed, but because they no longer fit the emerging order. A centralized church and bureaucratic state had little use for kings whose authority could not be regulated. The accusations of decadence and weakness that appear in later accounts may have served as justification. It is easier to replace a ruler portrayed as foolish than one believed to be sacred. By stripping the Merovingians of their mystical role, their removal could be framed as progress rather than sacrilege. Yet traces of the older belief system refuse to disappear. Medieval literature is filled with kings who are more than men. Arthur, the Fisher King, the hidden ruler awaiting return. These archetypes did not emerge from nowhere. They echo a memory of sacred kingship that once existed. The Merovingians may have been among the last rulers in Western Europe to fully embody this archetype. Their kingship was not merely administrative. It was cosmological. They were believed to stand at the center of a living order, responsible for maintaining harmony between worlds. Whether one calls them sorcerer kings or sacred guardians depends on perspective. To later rational historians, they appeared irrational, superstitious, even absurd. To their contemporaries, they were necessary. They carried the weight of continuity in a time when the world itself seemed fragile. This dual perception explains why their legacy is so conflicted. They're dismissed in textbooks, yet persist in legend. Their power is denied, yet endlessly speculated upon. They are remembered as weak kings, yet feared enough to be ritually neutralized rather than simply killed. In the end, the question may not be whether the Merovingians possessed supernatural abilities, but why people needed to believe they did. In an age of uncertainty, sacred kingship offered stability. It assured people that someone stood between them and chaos. And when that belief was finally taken away, it left behind a lingering unease, a sense that something essential had been lost along with the long-haired kings. As the Merovingian dynasty faded from visible power, something far more persistent began to take its place in memory: the idea of a bloodline that refused to end. Not a throne, not a kingdom, but a lineage, quiet, elusive, and deeply unsettling to later rulers. The Merovingian bloodline became the center of speculation precisely because it was never clearly extinguished. Where history should have drawn a firm line, it hesitated. And in that hesitation, legend took root. Blood mattered in the early medieval world in ways that are difficult to fully grasp today. Lineage was not just inheritance, it was essence. Blood carried legitimacy, memory, and destiny. To belong to a royal bloodline was to participate in something larger than oneself, something that transcended individual lifespans. The Merovingians understood this instinctively, and so did those who eventually replaced them. What makes the Merovingian bloodline so unusual is not that it claimed ancient origins. Many dynasties did, but that its origins were deliberately left ambiguous. Medieval genealogies trace the family back through shadowy figures, semi-mythical ancestors, and symbolic events rather than verifiable records. Some accounts link them to Trojan refugees, echoing Roman imperial myths. Others hint at divine or sea-born ancestry, language that seems fantastical but carries symbolic weight. These stories were not meant to be proven. They were meant to signal that this lineage belonged to a different category altogether. This ambiguity served a purpose. A bloodline whose origins cannot be fully explained cannot be easily challenged. Its authority does not rest on documents that can be disputed, but on belief that has accumulated over generations. The Merovingians ruled long enough for that belief to harden into tradition. When later dynasties sought to legitimize their own rule, they faced a problem. How does one replace a bloodline believed to be sacred? Military conquest alone is not enough. As long as people believe the old lineage still exists, the new rulers remain vulnerable. Rebellions, imposters, and prophecies all find fertile ground in such uncertainty. This is why the Merovingian bloodline had to be dealt with carefully. It could not simply be wiped out publicly. Executing every known member would have risked creating martyrs. It would also have required certainty that no heirs remained. And that certainty did not exist. Instead, the historical record becomes strangely evasive. Names disappear. Sons are sent to monasteries. Lines supposedly end without clear documentation. Noble families emerge claiming distant Merovingian descent, then quietly drop the claim. It is as if history itself is averting its eyes. Some medieval sources suggest that Merovingian children were deliberately scattered, absorbed into other noble houses under new identities. This would have been a practical solution. A bloodline diluted but preserved loses its political threat while maintaining continuity. Over generations, the sacred blood becomes invisible, indistinguishable from the aristocracy at large. Yet invisibility does not mean extinction. What troubled later rulers was not the possibility that a Merovingian might reclaim the throne by force, but that the idea of rightful blood could reawaken. If kingship was truly inherited through sacred lineage, then coronations, papal blessings, and legal reforms were merely surface rituals. The deeper legitimacy would always belong elsewhere. This anxiety surfaces repeatedly in medieval Europe. Claims of hidden heirs appear with remarkable frequency. Pretenders arise, claiming royal descent long thought extinct. Often these movements fail quickly, but their very existence reveals something important. People were willing to believe them. The Merovingians became the ultimate example of this phenomenon. A royal house officially declared finished, yet never fully erased. The phrase, "the bloodline that should not exist," captures this paradox perfectly. According to history, it ended. According to memory, it never did. Over time, the bloodline took on symbolic dimensions far beyond genealogy. It became associated with the idea of rightful kingship untouched by institutional corruption. In this sense, Merovingian blood was less about family trees and more about archetype. It represented a purer form of authority, one rooted in ancestry rather than approval. This symbolic power made the bloodline adaptable. In different eras, it was reinterpreted to suit prevailing concerns. During the Middle Ages, it was linked to prophetic kings. In later centuries, it became entangled with Grail lore and sacred guardianship. In modern times, it would be recast through conspiracy and alternative history. But at every stage, the core idea remained the same. Some lineages carry meaning that cannot be legislated away. What makes the Merovingian case especially compelling is how often it intersects with secrecy. Documents vanish. Archives fall silent. Stories persist in marginal notes rather than official texts. This pattern has led many to suspect deliberate suppression. Whether or not such suppression occurred, the perception of it has become part of the legend. Secrecy itself amplifies belief. A hidden bloodline feels more powerful than a visible one. The absence of proof becomes proof of absence only for those who trust official narratives. For everyone else, absence suggests concealment. It is also worth noting that medieval Europe was obsessed with lineage. Noble families guarded their genealogies fiercely. Claims of descent from ancient kings conferred prestige and authority. That so many families hesitated to openly claim Merovingian blood is telling. Such a claim may have been dangerous. It might attract unwanted attention from both secular and ecclesiastical powers. There is another layer to this mystery. Some traditions suggest that the Merovingian bloodline was not merely royal, but symbolic of a covenant, an agreement between the human and the divine. In this view, the bloodline was meant to endure quietly until a specific moment, not to rule constantly, but to be preserved. This idea appears repeatedly in prophetic literature. The rightful king sleeps. The heir remains hidden. The blood waits. Such narratives are not unique to the Merovingians, but they fit the pattern uncannily well. If the Merovingian bloodline did survive, it would not announce itself. It would do the opposite. It would blend in. It would pass unnoticed through generations, protected precisely by its ordinariness. Power hidden is power preserved. From this perspective, the true end of the Merovingians was not when they lost the throne, but when belief in sacred blood began to fade. Yet even then, it did not disappear entirely. It retreated into myth, into speculation, into the margins of history. Modern fascination with the Merovingian bloodline says as much about us as it does about them. In a world governed by systems and institutions, the idea that legitimacy might be inherited in secret is both thrilling and unsettling. It challenges the assumption that power is always visible and traceable. Whether the bloodline truly continues today is ultimately less important than why the question persists. The Merovingians represent the unresolved tension between history as record and history as memory, between what is documented and what is believed. A bloodline that should not exist continues to exist precisely because it occupies that space between certainty and doubt. And as long as that space remains, the Merovingians will never be fully gone. Among all the figures associated with the twilight of the Merovingian dynasty, none is more enigmatic, more tragic, or more heavily wrapped in prophecy than Dagobert II. His life reads less like a conventional royal biography and more like a carefully constructed myth, one shaped by exile, return, betrayal, and an ending so ambiguous that it has fueled speculation for over 1,000 years. If there was ever a Merovingian king whose story refused to close neatly, it was Dagobert II. Dagobert was born into a world already turning against his bloodline. By the mid-7th century, the Merovingians still wore crowns, but their grip on real power was weakening. Administrative control had slipped into the hands of the mayors of the palace, officials who ruled in practice while kings ruled in name. Yet even as their authority eroded, the Merovingians remained symbolically dangerous. Their blood still carried legitimacy. Their presence still mattered. Dagobert II was the son of King Sigebert III of Austrasia, one of the last Merovingian rulers to exercise genuine authority. From birth, Dagobert represented continuity, an unbroken line back to Clovis himself. This alone made him a threat. When his father died, Dagobert was still a child, and in the fragile politics of the time, that was enough to seal his fate. Instead of ascending the throne, Dagobert was removed from it. Accounts differ on how this happened, but the outcome is clear. The young prince was exiled, sent far from his homeland to an Irish monastery. Officially, this was framed as protection, education, even piety. In reality, it was neutralization. A Merovingian heir alive, but absent posed less immediate danger than one present and crowned. Ireland was no random destination. At the time, Irish monasteries were centers of learning, mysticism, and spiritual authority. They existed on the fringes of Roman Christianity, preserving older traditions alongside Christian doctrine. For a Merovingian prince, this was both exile and initiation. Removed from politics, but immersed in sacred knowledge. Dagobert spent years in this liminal state, neither king nor commoner, neither ruler nor erased. During this period, his legend began to form. Later sources suggest that he was recognized by some as the rightful king even in exile, that his presence carried weight, that his blood could not be ignored even across the sea. Eventually, circumstances shifted. The political landscape changed, alliances fractured, and Dagobert was allowed to return to the continent. He reclaimed the throne of Austrasia, becoming king not through conquest, but through recognition. This alone is remarkable. Few exiled princes ever returned. Fewer still reclaimed power without bloodshed. Yet Dagobert's reign was brief and unsettlingly quiet. Unlike earlier Merovingian kings, Dagobert II does not dominate chronicles with grand battles or sweeping reforms. Instead, his rule feels tense, constrained, and watched. He governed in a world where his authority was tolerated rather than embraced. Powerful figures surrounded him, men who had risen under the system that weakened his family. He was a king among rivals, a symbol among administrators. Then, suddenly he was dead. According to official accounts, Dagobert II was assassinated in the forest of Wovra around the year 679. The killing is described with striking vagueness. No dramatic trial, no clear culprit, just a king slain while hunting, a setting so common in medieval assassinations that it borders on formulaic. But it is what follows that raises questions. Dagobert's death did not produce the usual consequences. There was no sweeping purge of his supporters, no elaborate justification, no clear transition of power rooted in legitimacy. Instead, the Merovingian line drifted further into obscurity, as if the removal of Dagobert had been a final, necessary step rather than a political crisis. For many, this seemed too convenient. Almost immediately, rumors began to circulate that Dagobert had not truly died, that the assassination was staged, that a body had been substituted, that the king had withdrawn deliberately, preserving the bloodline rather than exposing it to annihilation. These rumors did not remain localized. They spread, evolving into legend. Dagobert II became associated with prophecy. Medieval texts speak cryptically of a king who would suffer exile, return briefly, and then vanish, only to be remembered as more than a ruler. Some traditions describe him as a rex quiescens, a resting king, not dead but dormant, waiting. This imagery is powerful and familiar. It echoes the legends of Arthur, Frederick Barbarossa, and other rulers said to sleep beneath mountains or beyond the veil of history. These are not stories of failure. They're stories of deferred destiny. Why Dagobert II specifically became associated with this archetype is revealing. He represented the last credible link to a fully legitimate Merovingian kingship. After him, the dynasty continued in name, but not in spirit. His removal marked a threshold. The Church's treatment of Dagobert adds another layer of complexity. Centuries after his death, he was venerated as a saint. Churches were dedicated to him. His memory was sanctified. This is unusual for a king supposedly assassinated in political violence. Sanctification transforms narrative. It reframes death as sacrifice, absence as purpose. Some interpretations suggest that Dagobert's sainthood served to neutralize his political significance. By elevating him spiritually, his earthly claims could be safely laid to rest. Yet this move may have backfired. Saints endure. Their stories are preserved. Their symbolism deepens. In certain esoteric traditions, Dagobert II is portrayed not merely as a victim, but as a guardian, a figure who willingly stepped aside to protect something greater than a throne, the bloodline, the covenant, the hidden inheritance of the Merovingians. Whether this interpretation is historical truth or later myth-making is difficult to determine. What matters is that Dagobert's story refuses to behave like ordinary history. Too much is left unsaid. Too many gaps remain. The location of his assassination, the lack of detailed records, the absence of a clear burial narrative, all of these details invite speculation. And speculation, once begun, is difficult to contain. In southern France especially, Dagobert II's name appears in connection with later mysteries. Genealogies hint at descendants. Symbols associated with his reign appear in unexpected places. While none of this constitutes proof, it reinforces the sense that his story did not end where the chronicles claim it did. Dagobert II stands at the heart of the Merovingian twilight because he embodies its contradictions. He was a legitimate king without lasting power, a ruler who returned only to disappear, a historical figure who became a prophetic symbol. If the Merovingian dynasty truly faded into irrelevance, Dagobert II should be a footnote. Instead, he became a focal point, the last king whose blood mattered enough to be feared, enough to be removed carefully, enough to inspire legends of survival rather than extinction. In this sense, Dagobert II is not just the end of a dynasty, but the beginning of its afterlife. His story marks the moment when Merovingian history passed into myth, not because it was forgotten, but because it could no longer be openly acknowledged. And in that transition, the prophecy was born. While the Merovingian kings still wore their crowns and carried the weight of ancient legitimacy, a quieter transformation was unfolding behind the scenes. Power was shifting, not through open rebellion or conquest, but through administration, routine, and proximity. By the time Dagobert II vanished from the stage of history, the real machinery of governance had already slipped into other hands. These men did not call themselves kings. They did not claim sacred blood, yet they would ultimately eclipse an entire dynasty. They were known as the mayors of the palace. At first glance, the title sounds harmless, almost domestic. A mayor suggests a steward, a caretaker of the royal household. And that is precisely how the position began. The mayor of the palace was originally responsible for managing the king's estates, overseeing servants, and ensuring the smooth functioning of the court. It was an administrative role, not a political one. But in a world where kingship was increasingly ceremonial, administration became power. As Merovingian rule matured, the kings delegated more and more of their daily responsibilities. The kingdom was large, fragmented, and difficult to manage. Assemblies needed organizing. Armies needed paying. Alliances required constant negotiation. The king, bound by ritual and tradition, could not always be present. The mayor could. Gradually, the mayor of the palace became the king's representative in matters of governance. He presided over councils, negotiated with nobles, and commanded troops. What began as service turned into authority. And authority, once normalized, rarely returns to its original source. This shift was subtle, almost invisible in its early stages. There was no moment when a Merovingian king formally surrendered power. No decree announcing a new order. Instead, power simply accumulated where decisions were being made. The king remained sacred. The mayor became effective. For the aristocracy, this arrangement was convenient. Dealing with a mayor was often easier than navigating the rituals and taboos surrounding a sacred king. The mayor could be negotiated with, pressured, even replaced. The king could not. Over time, the distinction between symbolic authority and practical power widened into a chasm. Merovingian kings continued to embody legitimacy, but legitimacy without control is fragile. The mayors of the palace, by contrast, had no ancient bloodline, but they had armies, wealth, and influence. This was not accidental. The rise of the mayors coincided with broader changes in European society. The church was becoming more centralized. Land ownership was consolidating. Military power was professionalizing. These developments favored administrators over sacred figures, systems over symbols. Yet the Merovingian kings were not immediately discarded. They were still useful. Their presence provided continuity. Their blood conferred legitimacy on decisions made in their name. In effect, The mayors ruled behind a living mask. Later historians would label the later Merovingian kings as Roisfanians, do-nothing kings. This phrase is revealing, not because it is accurate, but because it reflects the narrative constructed after their fall. To justify the takeover, the kings had to be portrayed as lazy, ineffective, irrelevant. But the truth is more complex. The Merovingian kings were not necessarily inactive. They were constrained. Their role had been hollowed out deliberately. Sacred kingship, once the foundation of authority, was being replaced by a new model that favored control, predictability, and institutional alignment, especially with the church. The mayors of the palace were ideally positioned to embody this shift. They were not bound by ancient taboos. They could cut their hair. They could be crowned by bishops without contradiction. They could rule as Christian administrators rather than sacred intermediaries. The most powerful of these mayors came from a single family, the Pippinids, ancestors of the Carolingians. Generation after generation, they held the mayoralty, expanding their influence while the Merovingians receded further into symbolic isolation. This continuity mirrored what the Merovingians themselves had once represented, but without the mystical dimension. Ironically, the mayors adopted some Merovingian strategies even as they undermined them. They emphasized lineage. They cultivated alliances. They framed their authority as natural and inevitable. But they did so without claiming sacred blood. Instead, they leaned increasingly on church approval. This alliance with the church was decisive. Unlike the Merovingians, whose authority predated ecclesiastical sanction, the mayors sought legitimacy through it. Bishops blessed their actions. Clergy recorded their deeds favorably. Over time, the narrative shifted. The mayors were portrayed as protectors of order, the kings as relics of a chaotic past. Yet this transformation was not without resistance. The very need to keep Merovingian kings alive, crowned, and visible suggests lingering fear. As long as a Merovingian existed, the possibility of restoration remained. Sacred blood does not lose its meaning simply because it is inconvenient. This is why the final transition had to be handled with extraordinary care. When the mayors eventually moved to claim kingship openly, they did not seize the throne by force alone. They sought papal approval. They reframed the question of rulership itself. Who should be king? They asked, not the one with sacred blood, but the one who actually governs. This argument would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries. It marks a profound shift in political philosophy. Kingship was no longer something one was born into. It was something one performed. Authority became functional rather than mystical. But such a shift required the erasure of memory. The Merovingian kings could not simply be removed. They had to be diminished. Their sacred attributes had to be recast as irrelevant. Their rituals reframed as empty gestures. Their bloodline portrayed as exhausted. The rise of the mayors of the palace was therefore not just a political takeover. It was a cultural revolution. It replaced one understanding of power with another. And like all revolutions, it rewrote the past to justify the present. What makes this moment so significant is that it marks the beginning of a new European order, one in which institutions would gradually eclipse lineage and doctrine would challenge blood. Yet the transition was never complete. Traces of the old system lingered, haunting the new. The Merovingian kings became symbols of what was lost. The mayors became symbols of what replaced them. Between the two lies a fault line that still shapes Western ideas of legitimacy. In the end, the mayors of the palace did not defeat the Merovingians in battle. They outlasted them. They absorbed their functions, redirected loyalty, and waited until the moment when the crown could be taken without bloodshed. And when that moment came, it was not announced as a revolution, but as common sense. This quiet rise, this administrative conquest, was far more effective than any war. It ensured that when the Merovingians finally fell, they would appear already gone. But appearances, as history repeatedly shows, can be deceiving. By the time the Merovingian dynasty reached its final phase, the transformation of power in the Frankish world was already complete. What remained was not a struggle for control, but a struggle for meaning. The Merovingians still embodied legitimacy, memory, and sacred ancestry, but the machinery of rule had moved elsewhere. The stage was set for one of the most consequential transitions in European history. And this transition would not be framed as a coup, but as a correction, not as betrayal, but as necessity. This was the Carolingian coup, the moment when history itself was rewritten. At the center of this transformation stood Pepin the Short, son of Charles Martel and mayor of the palace in all but name. Pepin did not conquer the throne in the traditional sense. He inherited control gradually, methodically, and almost invisibly. By the time he acted, resistance was minimal, not because it did not exist, but because it had been neutralized over decades. The Merovingian king at the time, Childeric III, was still alive. He still wore the crown. He still represented continuity with Clovis, with sacred kingship with ancient blood. And that was precisely the problem. As long as he existed, Pepin's authority, no matter how extensive, remained technically illegitimate. The question Pepin posed was deceptively simple. Who should be king? The one who holds the title, or the one who holds the power? This question, once asked, changed everything. Rather than answering it himself, Pepin turned to the church. This was a masterstroke. By asking Pope Zachary to decide, Pepin reframed kingship from a matter of ancestry to a matter of function. The Pope's response was carefully worded, but unmistakable. He declared that it was better for the one who exercised power to bear the royal title. With that sentence, centuries of sacred kingship were quietly overturned. The Church's endorsement did more than legitimize Pepin. It redefined legitimacy itself. Authority was no longer something inherited through blood and ritual. It was something granted through moral and institutional approval. This shift did not merely replace one dynasty with another. It replaced an entire worldview. The deposition of Childeric III was carried out with remarkable restraint. There was no execution, no public humiliation. Instead, his long hair was cut, severing the last visible symbol of Merovingian sanctity, and he was sent to a monastery. The act was surgical, ritual, symbolic. This was not vengeance. It was erasure. By sparing Childeric's life, the Carolingians avoided martyrdom. By shaving his hair, they neutralized his claim. By sending him into monastic silence, they removed him from history without bloodshed. It was the perfect ending for the new order. But endings are rarely as clean as they appear. What followed the coup was not simply a change in rulers, but a massive reinterpretation of the past. Carolingian scribes, chroniclers, and clerics set to work reshaping the narrative. Merovingian kings were recast as weak, idle, decadent. Their long hair became a symbol not of sanctity, but of excess. Their rituals were dismissed as superstition. Their sacred authority was reduced to myth. Meanwhile, the Carolingians were portrayed as restorers of order. Practical, God-fearing, necessary. This contrast was not accidental. It was propaganda, subtle, pervasive, and enduring. History, as we know, it was filtered through Carolingian pens. And those pens had a vested interest in delegitimizing what came before. Yet traces of discomfort remain in the sources. Carolingian chroniclers are strangely defensive. They insist, again and again, that the Merovingians were unfit to rule, that they had abdicated responsibility, that their removal was inevitable. Such insistence suggests anxiety, a need to convince not just readers, but perhaps themselves. If the Merovingians truly no longer mattered, why spend so much effort discrediting them? The answer lies in memory. Sacred kingship does not vanish simply because it is declared obsolete. It lingers in stories, symbols, and popular belief. The Carolingians understood this. That is why they sought not only political control, but spiritual continuity. They adopted coronation rituals. They emphasized divine favor. They framed themselves as chosen by God. Charlemagne, Pepin's son, would take this further than anyone before him. Crowned emperor by the Pope, He embodied the new synthesis of power, imperial authority sanctioned by the church. Yet even Charlemagne could not entirely escape the shadow of the Merovingians. His legitimacy rested on blessing, not blood, on ceremony, not inheritance. This difference mattered. The Carolingian coup marks the moment when Europe decisively shifted from ancient sacred kingship to medieval Christian monarchy. The king was no longer a mystical figure whose body carried authority. He became an office holder, sanctified by ritual, but defined by role. In doing so, something was lost. The Merovingians had represented a world in which power was organic, inherited, and inseparable from ancestry. The Carolingians represented a world in which power could be transferred, negotiated, and institutionalized. This made governance more stable, but it also made it more abstract. For some, this was progress. For others, it was rupture. It is telling that the Carolingian dynasty itself would not last. Within a few generations, it fractured, divided, and faded. Institutional authority proved no more eternal than sacred blood. Yet by then, the old model was gone. There was no return to Merovingian kingship. Not because it was impossible, but because it had been conceptually erased. Still, the erasure was never complete. Legends persisted. Prophecies circulated. Hidden bloodlines were whispered about. The idea that the Merovingians had been unjustly displaced found expression in stories of rightful kings in exile, waiting to return. These stories may not have threatened Carolingian rule directly, but they revealed an undercurrent of doubt. The Carolingian coup succeeded not because it crushed opposition, but because it changed the rules of legitimacy. It taught Europe to think differently about power. And once that mental shift occurred, the Merovingians could no longer reclaim their place, even if their blood survived. Yet the cost of rewriting history is that it never fully obeys. The very effort to suppress Merovingian mystique ensured its survival in altered form. Stripped of political reality, it became myth. And myth, unlike dynasties, does not need armies to endure. The Carolingians won the throne, but in doing so, they created a lingering question, one that would echo through centuries of alternative histories, secret genealogies, and prophetic speculation. What if the kings they replaced were not merely outdated, but unfinished? In that question lies the true legacy of the Carolingian coup. Not the end of a dynasty, but the birth of a mystery that history could never fully silence. The image is haunting in its simplicity. A king, once marked by sacred blood and ancient authority, stands silently as his long hair is cut away. No executioner's blade, no public spectacle of violence, just the slow, deliberate removal of something believed to be inseparable from who he is. In the official telling of history, this moment is treated as a footnote, the practical end of a failing dynasty. But when viewed through the lens of symbolism, ritual, and fear, it becomes something far more significant. The shaving of the Merovingian king was not merely an act of humiliation. It was a carefully calculated ending, designed to sever a form of power that could not be destroyed by force alone. To understand the weight of this act, one must remember what hair meant to the Merovingians. It was not an ornament. It was not tradition for tradition's sake. It was the visible sign of sacred legitimacy, inherited through blood and protected by custom. The king's hair marked him as different from all other men. It was believed to carry authority, memory, and divine favor. As long as it remained uncut, the king remained king, regardless of how little practical power he exercised. This is why the final Merovingian ruler, Childeric III, was not killed. An execution would have ended a life, but it might not have ended a belief. A martyr can inspire rebellion. A slain sacred king can become a symbol of injustice, a rallying point for restoration. The Carolingians understood this danger instinctively. They needed an ending that looked final without appearing violent, one that neutralized legitimacy without creating a legend of resistance. Shaving the king accomplished this perfectly. By cutting Childeric's hair, his sacred identity was symbolically destroyed. He was transformed from a king into an ordinary man, then further reduced into a monk, someone who had renounced worldly power altogether. This was not merely political theater. It was ritual deactivation, a deliberate act meant to strip away the metaphysical foundations of Merovingian rule. What makes this act so striking is how universal its meaning was. No proclamation was needed, no explanation required. Everyone understood what it meant. A shore Merovingian could not rule. The bloodline might still exist, but its visible authority was gone. Yet even in this act, there is an undercurrent of fear. If the Merovingians were truly obsolete, there would have been no need for ritual care. The king could have been ignored, imprisoned, or quietly eliminated. Instead, the transition was staged with almost religious precision. The Carolingians did not merely take the throne, they performed an ending. This suggests that something about Merovingian kingship still commanded respect, or at least caution. Sacred power, even when weakened, is not something rulers dismiss lightly. Symbols are dangerous. They endure beyond institutions. The monastery to which Childeric was sent completes the ritual. Monastic life was itself sacred, but in a fundamentally different way. A monk renounces lineage, ambition, and worldly authority. By placing the former king in such an environment, the Carolingians ensured that any lingering claims to power would be spiritually incompatible with political ambition. The king was not imprisoned, he was transformed. From a modern perspective, this may appear merciful. From a symbolic perspective, it was devastating. It erased the Merovingian model of kingship at its root. The sacred king, whose authority flowed from blood and body, was replaced by a ruler whose legitimacy flowed from church and institution. And yet, even this carefully staged ending did not fully succeed. Stories began to circulate almost immediately. Some claimed that the shaving was symbolic rather than permanent. That hair grows back. That blood cannot be cut away. Others whispered that the king in the monastery was not the true heir, but a substitute. That the real bloodline had already been hidden elsewhere. These stories may not have been widespread enough to threaten Carolingian rule, but they mattered. They reveal that belief in sacred blood did not vanish with the cutting of hair. It adapted. It retreated underground. The idea of the shorn king also took on a deeper psychological meaning. It marked the moment when Europe turned away from one understanding of authority and embraced another. Kingship became something granted, not embodied. Power became transferable, conditional, and regulated. But in making this shift, something ancient was lost. The Merovingians represented a form of rule in which the king's body mattered. His health, his lineage, his rituals, all were believed to affect the land and the people. Removing this model made governance more efficient, but also more abstract. Authority no longer felt personal or cosmic. It became administrative. This transition left behind a sense of absence, a feeling that something essential had been severed. The shorn king became a symbol of this loss. In later centuries, artists, poets, and chroniclers would revisit the image, not always consciously, but instinctively. The fallen king stripped of his sacred mark appears again and again in European imagination. It is the wounded fisher king, the exiled Arthur, the rightful ruler denied his throne. These archetypes did not arise in a vacuum. They echo a collective memory of sacred kingship undone. It is also worth noting that shaving, in many cultures, is associated with mourning, penance, or transition. The act carries weight. It signals an ending, but also the possibility of rebirth. Hair grows back. Identity can be reclaimed. This ambiguity may explain why the Merovingian legend never truly ended. The ritual was designed to close a chapter, but it left the door slightly ajar. A shaved king is not a dead king. A bloodline sent to a monastery is not annihilated. From a purely political standpoint, the Carolingians succeeded. The Merovingians never reclaimed the throne. The new model of kingship took hold. History moved forward. But on a symbolic level, the ending was incomplete. The care taken to neutralize Merovingian power suggests that it was never fully understood, even by those who feared it. Sacred authority does not behave like political authority. It does not disappear when institutions change. It persists in memory, ritual, and myth. The shorn king stands at the center of this unresolved tension. He represents the moment when one world ended and another began, but also the moment when history chose suppression over confrontation. Was the shaving of the Merovingian king an act of humiliation? Undoubtedly, but it was also something more deliberate, more profound. It was a ritual ending designed to transform belief itself. And yet, belief has a way of surviving even the most carefully staged rituals. The long hair was cut. The crown was taken. The king was silenced. But the idea of sacred blood, of a kingship that flowed through lineage rather than law, was not so easily erased. It slipped into legend, into prophecy, into the quiet spaces where history ends and memory begins. And there, the shorn king continues to wait, no longer ruling, no longer visible, but never entirely gone. Once the Merovingian kings were removed from power, their crowns taken and their symbols stripped away, history presents the illusion of finality. The throne passed to new hands. Chronicles moved on. The machinery of the Carolingian world settled into place. Yet beneath this surface of closure, something began to stir, quietly, persistently, and dangerously. It did not take the form of rebellion or open resistance. Instead, it survived as words, as fragments, as prophecy. The idea of a lost royal prophecy tied to the Merovingian bloodline did not emerge suddenly. It unfolded slowly, appearing in the margins of manuscripts, in the sermons of uneasy clerics, and in oral traditions passed carefully from one generation to the next. These prophecies never announced themselves boldly. They were coded, symbolic, and often deliberately incomplete. But taken together, they point toward a single unsettling idea. The Merovingian line was not finished. It was waiting. In the medieval mind, prophecy was not prediction in the modern sense. It was pattern recognition, a way of understanding history as cyclical rather than linear. Empires rose and fell, kings appeared and vanished. But beneath these changes ran a deeper current, one governed by divine timing rather than human ambition. Within this worldview, the fall of a sacred dynasty did not necessarily mean extinction. It can mean concealment. Several early medieval texts speak of a rex futurus, a future king who would emerge at a time of great disorder. These texts are frustratingly vague. They do not provide names or dates. They describe symbols instead, a king born of ancient blood, hidden in exile, returning when the land is divided and faith is weakened. Such language appears across Europe, but takes on particular resonance in regions once ruled by the Merovingians. The repetition is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. What is striking is that these prophecies rarely mention the Carolingians or their successors. The focus is not on restoring a recent political order, but on reawakening something older, something foundational. The rightful king is not described as a conqueror, but as a restorer of balance. His legitimacy flows from ancestry, not victory. This distinction matters. It suggests that the prophecy is not about power in the conventional sense, but about meaning. Church authorities were deeply uncomfortable with such ideas. Prophecy that legitimized kingship outside ecclesiastical approval threatened the church's role as arbiter of divine will. And so, many prophetic texts were quietly reinterpreted, sanitized, or sidelined. Some were reframed as allegories of Christ. Others were dismissed as apocalyptic fantasy. A few disappeared entirely. Yet prophecy is resilient. Even when suppressed, it adapts. In some versions, the Merovingian heir becomes a hidden guardian rather than an active ruler. He does not return to claim a throne, but to preserve a sacred inheritance. In others, he is linked to the land itself, his return coinciding with renewal, justice, and the restoration of harmony between ruler and people. These themes echo older traditions of sacred kingship. The king is not merely a political leader, but a mediator between worlds. His absence creates imbalance. His return restores order. One of the most persistent elements of the lost prophecy is timing. The return is always deferred. It does not happen soon or inevitably, but when conditions are right, when corruption has reached a peak, when authority has lost its moral center, when the world is ready to remember what it has forgotten. This open-endedness is precisely what makes the prophecy powerful. It cannot be disproven. It remains perpetually relevant, capable of being reinterpreted in every era of crisis. Over time, the Merovingian prophecy became intertwined with other mythic structures. The idea of the sleeping king beneath the mountain, the wounded ruler whose return heals the land, the hidden heir preserved through secrecy rather than force. These motifs appear again and again in medieval literature, often stripped of explicit historical reference, but rich with symbolic resonance. It is telling that many of these stories originate in regions once loyal to the Merovingians. Memory does not fade evenly. It lingers longest where it once mattered most. Some later traditions suggest that the prophecy was deliberately fragmented, that no single text ever contained the full message. Instead, pieces were scattered across monasteries, noble families, and oral lore. This fragmentation served as protection. A complete prophecy could be dangerous. A broken one could survive. The Church's response to these rumors was measured but firm. Official doctrine emphasized obedience to present authority. Kings ruled by gods as interpreted by the Church, not by blood alone. Any suggestion otherwise bordered on heresy. And yet, the Church could never fully eliminate the idea that some bloodlines carried special significance. After all, Christianity itself was built on sacred lineage. This contradiction created space for ambiguity. In moments of political instability, the prophecy resurfaced with renewed intensity. During times of famine, war, or disputed succession, whispers of the rightful king grew louder. They rarely named the Merovingians directly, but the implication was clear to those who knew the old stories. It is important to note that the prophecy did not always inspire action. Most of the time, it functioned as a quiet undercurrent, a way of expressing dissatisfaction without rebellion, a hope that legitimacy might one day be restored, even if no one could say how. This passive quality made the prophecy difficult to confront. You cannot arrest a whisper. You cannot execute an idea. For later rulers, the existence of such a prophecy was unsettling precisely because it could not be pinned down. It offered no clear enemy, no single claimant, just the persistent suggestion that the present order was provisional. Over centuries, the prophecy evolved. Renaissance scholars would reinterpret it through classical lenses. Enlightenment thinkers would dismiss it as superstition. Modern writers would recast it as conspiracy. Yet its core remained unchanged, the belief that the Merovingian legacy was unfinished. Some interpretations went further, suggesting that the prophecy was not about a literal king at all, but about the return of a principle, sacred authority, just rule, leadership rooted in lineage, responsibility, and cosmic balance rather than bureaucracy and coercion. In this view, the Merovingian king becomes an archetype rather than a person. This interpretation does not weaken the prophecy, it strengthens it. Archetypes do not age. They recur whenever conditions align. The lost royal prophecy, then, may never have been intended to culminate in a coronation. Its power lies in its refusal to resolve. It exists to remind, to unsettle, to suggest that history's endings are rarely as final as they appear. The Merovingians lost their throne. They lost their hair. They lost their place in official history, but they did not lose their future, at least not in the realm of belief. As long as people question legitimacy, as long as they sense a gap between power and justice, the prophecy remains alive. It waits, not for a king to return, but for the moment when the world begins to listen again. And in that waiting, the Merovingian twilight deepens, never fully night, never fully gone. High in the foothills of southern France, where the land folds into itself and history feels unusually dense, lies a small village that should have remained unremarkable. Rennes-le-Château is quiet, isolated, and modest in size. Yet over the past century, it has become one of the most contested landscapes in alternative history, not because of what is openly visible there, but because of what is believed to be hidden beneath it. Documents, symbols, secrets, and above all, the lingering shadow of a forgotten royal bloodline. At first glance, Rennes-le-Château seems an unlikely place to anchor legends of kings. There are no grand castles, no sprawling ruins, no obvious signs of royal presence. And yet, this very absence has fueled speculation. For centuries, the region around Rennes-le-Château existed at the margins of power, remote enough to conceal, old enough to remember. The story begins in the late 19th century with a parish priest named Bérenger Saunière. Assigned to the village in 1885, Saunière lived in relative poverty, like countless rural priests before him. Then, suddenly, his circumstances changed. He began spending lavishly. He renovated the church, constructed a private estate, built towers and gardens, and funded projects far beyond what his modest income should have allowed. When questioned, Saunière offered vague explanations. Donations, mass stipends, benefactors. None of these fully accounted for the scale of his spending. After his death, rumors spread that he had discovered something while renovating the old church. Parchments hidden in a pillar, a cavity, or beneath the altar. What those parchments contained is the subject of endless debate. Some claim they were genealogies. Others suggest coded messages. Still others believe they were copies of ancient documents linking the region to a royal secret long suppressed. Whatever Saunière found, or claimed to have found, set off a chain reaction that continues to this day. Rennes-le-Château soon became associated with hidden treasure, secret societies, and forbidden knowledge. But beneath all these layers lies a more specific and persistent claim that the village was connected to the Merovingian bloodline. Southern France had long been a refuge. During the Merovingian era, it was distant from royal centers in the north, difficult to control, and rich in older traditions. It was a land where Roman, Visigothic, and Frankish influences overlapped, creating cultural ambiguity. This made it an ideal place for concealment, especially for something that needed to survive without attracting attention. According to some theories, Rennes-le-Château sits atop or near sites that once protected Merovingian heirs, documents, or relics. These claims are not based on a single source, but on a convergence of symbols, place names, and historical anomalies. Church decorations commissioned by Saunière are among the most cited elements. Statues placed in unusual positions. Latin inscriptions that appear grammatically incorrect. Biblical scenes arranged in unconventional ways. Critics dismiss these as eccentric choices. Others argue they are deliberate codes, messages meant to be read symbolically rather than literally. One recurring motif is inversion. Things placed where they do not belong. Meanings reversed. Sacred imagery used in unsettling ways. This has led some to suggest that Saunière was signaling the presence of a truth hidden beneath official doctrine. But the real weight of Rennes-le-Château comes not from any single artifact, but from how often it intersects with Merovingian themes. Genealogical charts produced in the 20th century, some genuine, some forged, some impossible to verify, claim to trace surviving Merovingian bloodlines through noble families of southern France. These families were often obscure, politically inactive, and geographically distant from centers of power. Precisely the kind of families one would expect if survival depended on invisibility rather than dominance. Critics rightly point out the unreliability of many of these documents. Yet even false genealogies raise an important question. Why fabricate Merovingian descent at all? Why not claim Roman or Carolingian lineage, which carried clearer prestige? The answer may lie in symbolism. The Merovingians represented something different. Not just royalty, but sacred kingship unbroken by church control. Claiming descent from them was not about status. It was about legitimacy of a deeper kind. Rennes-le-Château also sits within a region dense with older myths. Cathar strongholds, temple routes, Visigothic treasures. This layering of lost causes and suppressed movements has created a cultural memory of resistance. Each era left behind fragments of defiance, encoded into landscape and legend. In this environment, the idea of a hidden Merovingian legacy does not feel out of place. It feels expected. Some theories go further, suggesting that Rennes-le-Château was not merely a hiding place, but a node, a point in a larger network of sites protecting knowledge. In this view, Sonier did not stumble upon treasure, but accessed part of a tradition, a chain of custody stretching back centuries. Whether this is true is impossible to prove, but the persistence of the idea reveals something important. People sense that Rennes-le-Château is not just a village. It is a symbol. Symbols attract stories because they resonate with deeper patterns. Rennes-le-Château sits at the intersection of secrecy and authority, church and bloodline, orthodoxy and heresy. It feels like a place where contradictions meet. The church's reaction to Sonier adds to the mystery. He was disciplined, investigated, and ultimately marginalized. Yet no clear charges were ever made public that explained the severity of the response. This ambiguity has fueled suspicion. Why silence a rural priest so thoroughly? Again, there is no definitive answer. But silence, like secrecy, amplifies speculation. Over time, Rennes-le-Château became a mirror. Each generation projected its own anxieties onto it. Treasure hunters saw gold. Conspiracy theorists saw suppressed truth. Alternative historians saw a missing chapter of European history. And through it all, the Merovingian shadow remained. What connects these interpretations is not evidence, but intuition. A sense that something foundational had been hidden, not destroyed. That history had been edited rather than erased. Rennes-le-Château embodies this intuition perfectly. It offers no clear proof, only layers. Every explanation opens another question. Every answer dissolves into symbolism. This is why mainstream historians are deeply uncomfortable with it. History prefers resolution. Rennes-le-Château refuses it. Even if Sonier discovered nothing more than a clever means of fundraising, the myth he inspired has taken on a life of its own. Myths endure because they speak to unresolved tensions, and the Merovingian story is full of them. The fall of a sacred dynasty, the rise of institutional power, the suppression of blood-based legitimacy, the possibility that something essential was lost in the transition. Rennes-le-Château gives these abstractions a physical location, a village where one can walk the streets, enter the church, and feel the weight of unanswered questions. Perhaps that is its true power, not as proof of hidden kings or secret documents, but as a reminder that history is not only what survives in archives. It is also what survives in doubt, in rumor, in places that refuse to feel complete. The Merovingian kings may have vanished from the throne, but in Rennes-le-Château, their shadow still lingers, not as certainty, but as possibility. In the realm of forgotten dynasties, possibility is often far more powerful than proof. As a Merovingian mystery deepens, it begins to merge with another enigma that has haunted European imagination for centuries, the Holy Grail. Not the glittering chalice of romantic legend, but something far more elusive and unsettling. A lineage, a secret, a living inheritance. The Grail bloodline theory suggests that the true treasure protected through the ages was never an object at all, but a bloodline, one carried, preserved, and concealed within the Merovingian dynasty. To understand why these two traditions became intertwined, one must first strip away the layers of medieval poetry and later romantic embellishment. The earliest Grail stories do not describe a simple cup. They describe a mystery, a vessel that sustains, heals, and legitimizes, a presence rather than a possession. In some versions, it is never even clearly defined. This ambiguity is not accidental. It mirrors the ambiguity surrounding the Merovingian bloodline itself. In esoteric interpretations, the word Grail is often broken into symbolic components, saying real or royal blood. Whether this linguistic connection is historically accurate is less important than why it resonated so powerfully. The idea that sacred authority flows through blood rather than objects fits seamlessly with Merovingian kingship. A dynasty believed to rule by inherited sanctity would naturally attract myths centered on holy lineage. From this perspective, the Grail becomes a metaphor, not for a cup used at the Last Supper, but for a continuation of sacred essence. A bloodline believed to carry divine significance, protected not by knights alone, but by secrecy, obscurity, and misdirection. The Merovingians, already burdened with legends of divine ancestry and sacred kingship, were a natural focal point for such speculation. They ruled at a time when Christian doctrine was still adapting to older beliefs. They embodied a form of authority that predated church-sanctioned monarchy. And when they fell, they did so quietly, without the total annihilation one would expect if their lineage were truly considered dangerous. The Grail bloodline theory proposes that this quiet ending was intentional. According to this view, the Merovingian dynasty served as a vessel for something the emerging medieval order could not fully control. Whether one interprets this something as literal descent from a holy figure or as symbolic guardianship of sacred tradition, the effect is the same. The bloodline had to be preserved, but hidden. Public power was too dangerous. Survival required anonymity. This theory gained renewed attention in the modern era, but its roots stretch much further back. Medieval Grail romances often feature a wounded or hidden king whose lineage determines the fate of the land. The king's blood is tied to fertility, justice, and cosmic order. When the bloodline is broken or concealed, the land suffers. When it is restored, harmony returns. These stories were not written in a vacuum. They emerged in regions once dominated by Merovingian rule, long after the dynasty's political fall. The archetype of the hidden king echoes too closely to be dismissed entirely. What is particularly striking is how the Grail legends avoid clarity. They refuse to name the king directly. They avoid explicit historical reference. This ambiguity has often been interpreted as literary technique, but it can also be read as protection. Secrets survive best when they are wrapped in story rather than stated plainly. The Church's relationship with Grail lore was always uneasy. On one hand, it tolerated the stories, framing them as moral allegories. On the other, it discouraged literal interpretations that might undermine ecclesiastical authority. A bloodline sanctified independently of the Church was theologically problematic. This tension mirrors the Church's earlier discomfort with Merovingian kingship. Both challenged the idea that divine authority flowed exclusively through clerical channels. Both suggested that sanctity could be inherited. Over time, the Grail bloodline theory expanded to include networks of guardians, knights, monks, and later, secret societies. Whether historical or imagined, these guardians serve an important narrative function. They explain how something so valuable could survive centuries of political upheaval without leaving clear evidence. Yet one must be cautious. The line between symbolism and literal belief is thin here. It is entirely possible that the Grail bloodline theory emerged not from secret knowledge, but from collective memory, a memory of sacred kingship, displaced but not forgotten, reimagined through myth. What matters is not whether the Grail was real in a physical sense, but why people needed it to be something more than a cup. Objects can be stolen, destroyed, or displayed. Blood cannot be so easily controlled. The Merovingians, through this lens, become less a dynasty and more a vessel. Their importance lies not in what they ruled, but in what they carried. When they lost political power, the vessel remained, but it could no longer be visible. This interpretation also explains why later rulers worked so hard to discredit them. A sacred bloodline threatens any authority that rests on appointment rather than inheritance. The Carolingians needed the Merovingians to appear obsolete, not special. Weak, not sacred. The Grail bloodline theory resists that narrative. It reframes the Merovingian fall as strategic withdrawal rather than failure. It suggests that true power does not always seek visibility. Sometimes it seeks endurance. Critics argue, correctly, that there is no direct evidence linking the Merovingians to a literal Grail lineage. No documents conclusively prove such a connection. But absence of evidence has never stopped belief, especially when belief fills a conceptual gap. The gap, in this case, is legitimacy. Modern societies struggle with the idea that authority might be inherited in ways institutions cannot regulate. The Grail bloodline theory taps into that discomfort. It suggests that history's winners may not be its rightful heirs, that something older and more authentic might persist beneath the surface. In this sense, the Grail is not about Christianity alone. It is about continuity, about the transmission of meaning across generations, about the idea that some lineages carry responsibility as well as privilege. Whether the Merovingians truly guarded such a lineage or simply became symbols of it is ultimately unknowable. But their story fits the pattern too well to be ignored. A sacred dynasty, a quiet fall, persistent rumors of survival, legends of hidden kings and guarded blood. The Grail bloodline theory does not demand belief to be powerful. It demands reflection. It asks why certain myths refuse to die, why some names echo longer than others, why history, despite its best efforts, cannot fully close the chapter on the Merovingians. Perhaps the Grail was never meant to be found. Perhaps it was meant to be carried. And if so, the Merovingians may not have been its masters, but its keepers. In that role, their disappearance becomes not a defeat, but a fulfillment, a transition from visibility to survival, from throne to shadow. And in the realm of sacred mysteries, shadows often endure far longer than crowns. If the Merovingian bloodline truly survived beyond its fall from power, whether as literal lineage, sacred principle, or symbolic inheritance, then one question becomes unavoidable. Survival on such a scale does not happen by accident. Bloodlines fade naturally. Memories erode. Records disappear. And yet, the Merovingian shadow persists. Not loudly, not openly, but with remarkable consistency. This persistence suggests something else at work. Not a single conspiracy, but an order of silence. Silence, in this context, does not mean emptiness. It means restraint. Protection through omission rather than proclamation. If there was a secret worth guarding, the safest way to preserve it was not to defend it publicly, but to ensure it was never fully articulated at all. Throughout medieval Europe, secrecy was not unusual. Knowledge was power, and power was dangerous. Monasteries guarded manuscripts. Noble families guarded genealogies. Guilds guarded techniques. Silence was a form of insurance against upheaval. And in a world where dynasties rose and fell violently, survival often depended on knowing what not to say. The Merovingian legacy fits neatly into this culture of guarded knowledge. If sacred kingship truly threatened the emerging order, then those closest to it would have understood that open preservation was impossible. Protection required fragmentation, stories broken into symbols, lineages hidden within other lineages, truths diluted into myth. This is why the idea of an order should not be imagined as a centralized group issuing commands. It was likely nothing so dramatic. More likely, it was a shared understanding across generations, among monks, nobles, and clerics, that certain things were not to be recorded plainly. Monasteries play a central role in this interpretation. They were the primary keepers of knowledge in the early medieval world. They decided what was copied, what was preserved, and what quietly disappeared. A manuscript not recopied might as well not exist. If a text suggested that kingship derived from blood rather than church sanction, its survival would have been precarious. Such ideas could destabilize both political and theological authority. The safest approach was ambiguity. Preserve fragments. Preserve symbols. Avoid clarity. This may explain why so many Merovingian-related traditions survive only as hints. A phrase in a chronicle. A genealogical gap. A saint's life that seems oddly political. Silence becomes the medium of transmission. Noble families may have played a similar role. Claims of descent from ancient kings were common, but Merovingian descent was treated differently. It was rarely declared openly. When it appeared, it was often accompanied by immediate disclaimers or obscurity. This suggests caution rather than pride. To claim Merovingian blood was to claim a legitimacy older than the church's authority. Such a claim could attract suspicion, surveillance, or worse. Silence was safer. Over time, this restraint may have evolved into something resembling tradition. Certain families knew not to speak of certain ancestors. Certain monasteries knew which manuscripts were not to be circulated widely. The knowledge survived, but without visibility. The church's role in this silence is complex. On one hand, it benefited from suppressing alternative sources of legitimacy. On the other, it was deeply invested in continuity. The church does not erase history lightly. It reframes it. By absorbing elements of sacred kingship into Christian ritual, coronations, anointing, divine right, the church neutralized the threat while preserving the structure. This made open confrontation unnecessary. Yet reframing is not the same as forgetting. The persistence of Merovingian motifs and later symbolism suggests that complete erasure never occurred. Instead, the ideas were redirected. Sacred blood became divine right. Ritual kingship became coronation. The source changed, but the form remained. This redirection required careful management. Too much suppression would invite curiosity. Too much openness would invite challenge. Silence struck the balance. Later traditions would personify this silence through secret orders, the Templars, hidden brotherhoods, unnamed guardians. While such interpretations often overreach, they reflect an intuitive understanding. Survival required protection, and protection required discretion. Even if no single group consciously guarded a Merovingian secret, the effect was the same. The truth, whatever it was, remained just out of reach. Always suggested, never confirmed. This pattern continues into modern times. Documents surface, then are questioned. Genealogies appear, then collapse under scrutiny. Each revelation brings more doubt rather than clarity. The silence adapts. It is tempting to view this as failure, but perhaps it is success. If the goal was endurance rather than dominance, silence was the ideal strategy. Power that hides survives longer than power that confronts. The Merovingians, once removed from the throne, may have transitioned from rulers to relics, not in the sense of being worshipped, but in the sense of being preserved. Relics are not meant to be used. They are meant to endure. This reframes the idea of guardianship. The protectors of the secret were not waiting for a return. They were waiting for the right forgetting, a time when the secret no longer threatened the world, and the world no longer threatened it. In this light, the order of silence becomes less sinister and more patient, less conspiratorial and more human. It is the silence of people who understood that some truths, once spoken openly, are destroyed rather than revealed. History, after all, does not reward those who speak too soon. The Merovingian mystery survives because it was never fully explained, because it was allowed to dissolve into legend rather than crystallize into doctrine, because silence protected it from both belief and disbelief. And perhaps this was intentional, because once a truth becomes too clear, it becomes vulnerable. The order of silence did not preserve certainty. It preserved possibility. And in the long twilight of forgotten kings, possibility is the most powerful legacy of all. By the time the Merovingian kings vanished from the throne, history insisted that the story was over. The dynasty had fallen. Power had changed hands. A new order had risen, confident in its legitimacy and eager to move forward. And yet, despite every effort to declare an ending, something lingered. Not as a rebellion, not as a rival court, but as a presence, quiet, unresolved, and strangely enduring. This is why the Merovingian twilight never truly ended. Twilight is not darkness. It is the space between, a time when outlines blur, when certainty softens, when one world dissolves but another has not yet fully formed. The Merovingians did not collapse into oblivion. They faded, and fading is far more dangerous than disappearance. because it leaves behind questions rather than conclusions. After the Carolingian takeover, the Merovingians ceased to matter politically. No armies marched in their name. No crowns were contested on their behalf. And yet, their memory refused to behave like that of a defeated dynasty. It did not settle into nostalgia or irrelevance. Instead, it drifted, reappearing in unexpected contexts, reshaped but recognizable. This persistence suggests that what ended was not the Merovingians themselves, but their visibility. The sacred kingship they embodied could not survive openly in a world moving toward institutional authority. The church required kings it could crown, guide, and correct. Bureaucracies required rulers who could be replaced without destabilizing the cosmos. The Merovingians, whose legitimacy flowed through blood and ritual, belonged to an older grammar of power. So that grammar was retired. But languages do not vanish overnight. They linger in idioms, in borrowed words, in unconscious patterns of thought. The Merovingian idea of kingship survived in exactly this way, no longer spoken plainly, but embedded in myth, legend, and longing. Throughout the Middle Ages, stories proliferated of rightful kings in exile, rulers who did not die, but withdrew, kings whose return would restore justice, fertility, and order. These were not merely fairy tales. They were cultural echoes, expressions of an unresolved transition. The Merovingians became the template for this archetype, even when unnamed. The idea of the hidden king is powerful because it implies continuity without confrontation. It suggests that legitimacy can endure without asserting itself, that true authority does not always announce its presence. This idea resonated deeply in societies that had witnessed violent transitions of power and learned to distrust overt claims. In this sense, the Merovingian twilight functioned as a psychological refuge. It allowed people to imagine that something ancient and rightful still existed, even if it could not act. That justice had not been destroyed, only postponed. This postponement is crucial. The Merovingian story does not end with resolution, but with suspension. No final battle, no clear extinction, just a gradual retreat into obscurity. This ambiguity invites interpretation, and interpretation keeps memory alive. Later dynasties sense this unease, even if they could not articulate it fully.